Good morning. Can you hear me okay in the back? Do you want to hear me okay in the back? You know, I got thinking as Scott was introducing me, it would be a real bummer if we have actually been here 20 years, but we really love being a part of this church for 15 and a half years. So I'm hoping the years are right. It is a thrill to be here. I'm honored to have the chance to speak. We love this church family personally. We also love this church family professionally. There is not another congregation that is more special and more important to Oklahoma Christian than Memorial Road because of history and location and so many relationships. In fact, if you're a faculty or a staff member or a retired or former faculty staff member, if you're an alum, if you're a student, if you're a family member of one of those folks, if you're a trustee of OC, would you please stand so we can see how many OC folks we have in the audience this morning? All right. Yeah, amen. Okay, for everyone who remains seated, it's not too late. You can enroll today for this fall. Well, I'm honored to be here. I got to tell you, I'm also a little bit nervous. I always get nervous because of something that happened decades ago to me. I spent my youth group years in Tahlequah. There was a pretty strong youth group, and a number of us young men got to go to different congregations around, and we would lead the services. We would preach, or we would do the announcements, we'd lead singing, we'd do the Lord's Supper, all sorts of different things. Well, when I was 16 years of age, I was invited to go to the Moody Church of Christ and preach. It was this time of year. I was not invited to go and preach because I was a good preacher. I was invited to go and preach because my grandmother, Mama Deem, was related to half of the people at the Moody Church of Christ. So Mama Deem and I got on a red Chevy Citation. We drove to Moody, and I am preaching away. I get kind of hot. I take my jacket off. I keep preaching. The room keeps getting hotter and hotter. The vision on the corners of my eyes begin to, it kind of gets gray, and it starts working its way toward the middle. The room begins to spin. The next thing I know, I am laying flat on my back. I have passed out during my own sermon. There are 6 adults that are there up on the stage. It's a small stage, and they're squatted around me. One of the guys sees my eyes open, and he says, "Back off, he needs air, he's coming to." They helped me to my feet, and I did what any self-respecting 16-year-old wannabe preacher would do. I finished my sermon. So Mama Deem and I get back in her car, and we're driving back to Tahlequah. Now, I was her favorite. She never had a cross word for me. She never had a criticism. It was always encouragement. It was always good news. And I'm thinking, what is Mama Deem going to say to me today? So we're driving back to Tahlequah, and she's looking out the passenger window, and after a couple of minutes, she looks over at me, and she says, well, you don't see that every Sunday morning now, do you? So we get home, we rest up, we go to church that night. One of my buddies comes up to me, and he says, "John, I heard you preached at Moody this morning. How did it go?" I looked around to make sure Mama Deem wasn't within earshot, and I said, "It was unbelievable." And he said, "Unbelievable? What do you mean?" I said, "It was unbelievable. I had 6 people come forward during my sermon this morning." So if I go down, I need 7 of you all to please come up. By the way, one of the elders before service gave me a note to read. Let's see what it says here. "Dear guests, thank you for joining us at the Memorial Road Church of Christ this morning. Please know John is not our regular preacher. As far as we know, he is not anyone's regular preacher. Please give us a second chance and come back next Sunday." We love choice. We love to make decisions. Now, the one exception is when you're in a car with a bunch of your friends and somebody says, "Where should we eat?" Nobody wants to make that decision. But other than that, we love to make choices, even when it's hypothetical and we will never have that opportunity. Early in our marriage, Darla and I, every single year, we were on the verge at this one particular time of year of becoming fabulously wealthy. It happened year after year after year. You see, we would go to the mailbox, and in the mailbox was a letter. And on this envelope was a picture of Ed McMahon. Now, you might not know Ed McMahon, but he was the sidekick of Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, and for you young people, that still doesn't help you out, but he was an important guy. And this was Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstakes. Every year, they sent out this big mass mailing, and they were giving away a fabulous amount of money. Now, I understand they still do it today, but it's all on the internet, so it's not as real as it used to be. I would fill out the form, and Darla and I would make choices about how we were going to spend all of this money we were going to get. And man, we decided we were going to give a bunch of money to church, and we were going to give a bunch of money to our university. And just so you know, I still endorse those two operations for us to give to. But then we also decided that we would support our nieces and nephews in college. We'd pay for my mom and dad's house. We would pay it off. And then, for us, we might buy a used refrigerator or something. I mean, this was all about altruism because I knew that 90% of the people who got this letter from Ed McMahon would not send it in. And the other 10%, no way could they have made as good of choices as we did. So God was going to bless us with all of this wealth this year. Now, at the end of the form, you might remember this if you ever filled one out, there were 2 boxes. And one box said, "Enter me in the sweepstakes, and these are all the magazines I want to subscribe to." I never checked that box. I checked the next box that said, it seemed like it was in smaller print, "Enter me in the sweepstakes, but I don't want any magazines at this time." So I kind of knew, I was making all these choices, but maybe it wasn't going to come true. So let me ask you, if you had your heart's desire, what community would you make your home? Man, when I ask people that question, often there are people that say, beach. I want to live at the beach. That's where I'm going. But somebody else will say, the mountains for me. My community is going to be in the mountains. Somebody might say, I want to live in the big city. Man, it's exciting. There's always something going on. Great places to eat. That's where I want to be. Others would say, give me the small town. I want to know everybody, and I want everybody to know me. Some might even say rural. I want a lot of elbow room. This time of year, you might say, I want to live in Minnesota. 6 months from now, you might say, I want to live in South Texas. Lots of different factors that we think about when we decide where or how or what to make community. In the Old Testament, we have 2 stories of individuals that made decisions about their community, and they looked at very different things. In Genesis chapter 13, Abram and Lot, they have grown fabulously wealthy. They have herds and flocks and servants. They have tents and silver and gold, and they leave Egypt and go through the Negev, and then they continue to go to place to place to place. And they arrive at Bethel. This is the place where Abram first set up an altar to worship God. And Abram realizes that the land's not enough to take care of these 2 massive parties. And so he turns to Lot and says, we need to stop quarreling, and we need not to have quarrels between our herdsmen. The land can't handle both of us. We need to part. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And Lot looked around, and he saw the plain of the Jordan. He saw that it was well watered. He saw that it was lush like the garden of the Lord, and he said, I will go east to the Jordan plain. Abram went to Canaan. Lot made his decision on community based on place. In Ruth chapter 1, we read a different story. Elimelech and his wife Naomi, they're in Bethlehem, and famine has set in. So they take their 2 sons and they move to Moab. That's where they can find food and make a living. Elimelech dies. The 2 sons get married, and then 10 years later, the 2 sons have died. Naomi calls her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and says, I understand now that things are good back in Judah, and so we need to return there. So they prepare and they get on the road and they're heading back to God's promised land. And then Naomi stops them and says, You all have been faithful to me, and you've been faithful to the dead, and God will be faithful to you. You need to go back to your mother's households. There you will find husbands that you can marry." And the girls cried, but they said, "No, Naomi, we are staying with you." But Naomi was insistent. She said, "There's nothing for you where I'm going. There are no husbands, and if I will never have any more children. And even if I did, you could not wait for the sons to grow up to marry." And so Orpah cries and kisses her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth responds, and Ruth talks about her community in a way that we have repeated in weddings for years and years. You see, Ruth, talking about community, says, "Where you stay, I will stay. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, that's where I die, and that's where I'll be buried." God cares about our community. God cares less, though, about the where of our community and way more about the what and the how of our community. Man, community is a special place. Community is a place that influences us, but at the same time, we influence our community. Think about it. The community that you find yourself a part of, it can give you joy or it can make you sad. It can welcome you in or it can push you out. It can make you think about the good things or it can make you have difficulty with the difficult times. It can encourage you or it can discourage you. But place is important. In fact, God has always told us that our community that we are a part of is critical. So it's the day of Pentecost. Peter is preaching. We know that Jesus has lived, has died, has been buried and resurrected. He's been with hundreds of his followers, and then he has ascended to heaven. And his followers are told to go and wait in Jerusalem. And it's the day of Pentecost, and Peter preaches the first gospel meeting. And we know that 3,000 put on baptism and become Christians. What happens immediately after that is pretty fascinating. In the days and weeks and the months to come, we find out what that brand new community was like. In Acts chapter 2, beginning in about verse 42, listen to what the early church community was like. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together, and they had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Now that was in the immediate aftermath of the beginning of the church. 25, 30 years later, Paul writes about the fellowship of the believers. Now, this is the same Paul who knew how dangerous the fellowship of the believers were. He understood how dangerous this new community was, and he did everything in his power to stamp it out. He arrested people. He stood as witness while people were killed. He was on his way to Damascus to arrest more and haul them back to Jerusalem when he encountered Jesus. 25 or 30 years following this account of the day of Pentecost, this is what Paul writes about community. In Romans chapter 12, beginning in verse 10, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Don't repay evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Community is important. Community is important to all of us. Okay, so we get that, deSteiguer, but how do you create great community? How do you sustain great community? Well, the good news is, I think in a few weeks, Phil is going to have a series on community, and so that's where the answers will come. But I want to tell you a couple of thoughts that I've got up front. I love to read books. My daughter, who just moved to Rhode Island, said, "Dad, you need to read this particular author." Her name is Brene Brown. She's a psychologist. She's a researcher that lives down in Houston. And so about a month or month and a half ago, I was passing through our office in our home, and I saw a book called Rising Strong, a book that she had written. So I take the book and I read through it. She has 2 encounters and then a story that's told to her that I think talks about community in a really special way for us. So how do we build community? Well, here's the 2 stories, and then here's the encounter, or the 2 encounters, and then the story that she heard. So Brene was going to speak at a conference. And at this conference, she really didn't want to go, but she thought that she should, so she did. She got there. There was a roommate. She didn't want to share a room with somebody. And she had a really bad impression of this person that she shared the room with. And so she came out of that with kind of a difficult attitude, and she was convinced that people didn't try to do their best. They just kind of skated by. Well, she's a researcher also, so she thought that she probably ought to verify that with some of her friends. And so she talked to a lot of her friends and said, "Okay, what do you think? Do people really try their best, or do they just coast?" And almost everybody said, "Well, you know, Brene, we think people try pretty hard. We think they're giving it their best shot." Well, she couldn't believe that they were seeing it completely different from her. Another encounter that she had as she was trying to think about whether people try their hardest, her mom has surgery. She and her sisters go to the hospital, spend the day in the hospital with their mom that just had surgery. At the end of the day, the sisters and Brene leave the hospital and they go to a nearby downtown cafe. And as they're in that diner eating, there's an altercation, and there is a homeless fella who is actually kicked out of the restaurant. When Brene and her sisters leave, they kind of walk past him, and Brene looks at him and she sees 2 things. One, she sees that it appears, and she had some knowledge of this, because of the bone structure in his face, it appeared to her that he had suffered physical abuse in the past, maybe multiple times. She also looked into his eyes, and she felt that he had this feeling that was like, how has my life turned out like this? And Brene began to approach him, but when he saw that she was coming to him, he turned and left. Early the next morning, Brene goes back to the hospital to check on her mom. She goes in the very front lobby, and she's immediately struck by beautiful music. Somebody is at the grand piano there in the lobby playing Memories. She has a smile on her face. She thinks, "Oh, this is great." As she rounds the corner, she looks and she's stunned because the fellow who's sitting at the seat playing the grand piano is the homeless fellow that she saw the night before. And Brene says to somebody behind the desk, she says, "Hey, I think that fellow's homeless." And the person behind the desk said, "Yeah, he is homeless. He's been coming in the mornings every day for this past year, and he'll play a few songs, and then security will make him leave." And that happens right then. Brene goes up to her mom's room, and she tells her mom, "Mom, I think there's something I'm supposed to be learning, but I don't know what it is." And she tells her mom about these 2 stories. And then Brene's mom says, "Brene, I've got a story that I want to tell you about your grandmother." And remember, the question is, how do we build community? How do we sustain community? And Brene got up on the foot of her mom's hospital bed and curled up and listened to her mom talk. And here's what her mom said. "When I was 5 years of age, my family moved to San Antonio. We lived about a half a block away from the train tracks. And where the train tracks were close to our house, they actually went up this steep hill because they got on this viaduct that went over a part of a low spot. And there was this grassy kind of field right there. And as trains would come right through here, they really slowed down. It was like a perfect spot for hobos to get on the train or get off the train. And Brene's mom continued. She said, and your grandmother, Meemaw, she always prepared food, and she prepared way more food than our family needed. Under the sink in a dishpan, she had 5 metal plates and 5 metal cups and 5 forks. And Brene, there were a lot of days where there was a knock at the door, and Meemaw would go to the door, and there was one or more hobos right there. And she would come back in the house, and she would fill up the plates, and she would fill up the cups, and she would take them to the hobos, and they would eat on the front porch, or they would eat down in the front swing in the front yard. And Brene said, well, Mom, how did hobos know to come to your house? How did they know about that? And her mom said, well, we were marked. You see, hobos learned where people were kind and generous and hospitable. And they talked among themselves. But what they also did was they would make a mark on the fence post or on the curb in front of a house if this was a house where people would welcome them, where they would see hospitality and generosity, where they would see kindness. I told this story in early service this morning. 3 men came up to me and said their moms served hobos regularly. And they also said that their homes were marked. Literally, hobos would place a mark. One of the guys told me it was a small red cross, and he still has the fence piece that had the mark on it. You know, this is the origin of the phrase, he or she is an easy mark. When we talk about somebody being easy mark, we think they're innocent or naive or gullible. You can take advantage of them. Well, the origin of that phrase is if someone is an easy mark, they are somebody that will take care of other people. So Brene's mom said, that's how hobos knew they could come to our home. But Brene said, but okay, Mom, I understand that the hobos know they can go there, but how did Meemaw know that she could trust the hobos and take care of them? How? And her mom said there were 3 things. The first thing was this. Meemaw knew others personally. She knew hobos personally. You see, the lady across the street, her good friend, had a little brother, and after World War II, the little brother decided to live the life of a hobo. And so Meemaw knew hobos personally, and that's why she was willing to be involved in their lives and they in hers. A few years ago at Oklahoma Christian, there's kind of a good example of this. We had some students who were going and eating from time to time at the McDonald's at the corner of Bryant and Memorial. Now, I'm convinced that our students were going there to eat regularly to remind themselves how good the food in the cafeteria on campus was. As they would go there, they met an older woman. Her name was Betty. Betty was different than them in almost every way, but they became acquaintances of her, and then they became friends of her over time. They go in one day, and Betty's not there, and they ask where Betty is, and come to find out Betty's job has been eliminated along with a couple of others. And they're distraught about that because they know and love Betty. They come back to campus, they meet with Kurt Hermanson and say, Kurt, he runs our food service. You've got to hire this woman. She has a lot of food experience, and she's great. And Kurt says, well, I can't promise I'll hire her, but I'll interview her. And so they get Betty there for an interview, and Kurt hires her. She's in charge of our dessert bar in the cafeteria for many years. She always asked 3 questions of the students as they came through. One question was, are you going to church? Second question, are you going to chapel? Third question, are you going to class? Those are pretty good questions to ask college students today. I'm not sure if you had to answer yes to all 3 to get a cookie or more dessert, but those were the questions that she asked. Now, that's a pretty great story. Students getting to know somebody personally, and they take care of that individual. The reality is the story gets even better. You see, Miss Betty lived about 3 miles north, and she did not have a driver's license, and she did not have a car. And if you knew Betty, you would be relieved that she did not have a driver's license or a car. Every morning, one of those students or a staff member that they worked with would wake up early. They would drive 3 miles north to Betty's apartment. They would pick her up and bring her to campus. At the end of the day, another student would pick her up in the cafeteria and take her home. They referred to their effort, their ministry, as driving Miss Betty. They had a birthday party for Miss Betty. They gave her a T-shirt, and on the T-shirt, it was a picture of Morgan Freeman in chauffeur clothes from Driving Miss Daisy, and in the rearview mirror, if you look closely, you could see Miss Betty sitting in the back seat of the car. And she kind of liked that. She was proud of that T-shirt, but after a couple of minutes, she said, "Yeah, but I like this, but who's this guy driving my car?" And so it was a chance to kind of educate her culturally as well. When we get to know people personally, not just about them, community begins to form in a special way. So the first thing that Mima did was she knew others personally. The second thing is this, according to Brené's mom. When we see somebody who is different than us, when we see somebody who has struggles and difficulties, when we see somebody who in some ways lives on the margin of society, sometimes we think of them as the other. Well, Mima didn't do that. Mima, she grew up in poverty. She grew up in an abusive situation. She was an alcoholic. She had been divorced. She didn't see people as different or as other. Rather, she saw herself as the other as well. To create community, we need to realize that we all have a lot more similarities than we do differences. You know, I'm convinced there are two categories of people in this world. This category here is all the people that have sinned or have difficulties or complications. They need God and they need people in their lives. That's one category of people. The second category of people, these people have never sinned. They don't have any complications. They don't need God. They don't need anybody. Let me tell you, there is nobody in this category right here. We are all in this category. Paul tells us, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then Brené's mom said there was a third thing about Mima. You know, she knew these people personally. She did not consider them the other because she was the other too. But when it came to need, she had no problem. You see, she was very willing to help others because during her whole life, people had helped her. I think it takes a really strong person to offer help to someone else. But sometimes it takes even more strength to accept the help. This is a great community. This is a community that loves each other. But we can sustain that and we can do better, and God wants us to have a community that lifts us all up. We need to know each other personally. We need to realize that we are all in the same boat, and we need not to be afraid of need. If you haven't been baptized, that's a great thing to do, and it's a great thing to do this morning. Like those men and women on the day of Pentecost, putting on Jesus in baptism. Or maybe you need prayers of encouragement or for strength. Maybe you need to repent. Maybe you just need the support of this church body. If there's anything that we can do for you, would you please come down to the front while we stand and sing?